There is a painting sitting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City that stops people dead in their tracks every single day. It is over 11 feet wide. It took 2 years to complete. And when it was first unveiled to the public in 1857, the organizers did something almost unheard of in the art world at the time. They charged admission just to see a single painting. Not an exhibition, not a collection. One painting. And people paid. They lined up around the block the way audiences lined up for theater, for opera, for the great public spectacles of the 19th century. Because that is exactly what it was. A spectacle. The artist behind it was not Rembrandt, not Monet, not any of the European masters whose names fill every art history textbook you have ever opened. His name was Frederick Edwin Church. He was American-born, trained on the banks of the Hudson River, and by the time he was 30 years old, he was the most famous painter in the United States. Not one of the most famous, the most famous. And most Americans today have never heard of him. That painting, The Heart of the Andes, is considered one of the greatest works ever produced on American soil. It is not a small canvas you glance at while walking through a gallery. It is nearly 10 feet wide and 5.5 feet tall. Church painted it after 2 expeditions to South America, filling dozens of sketchbooks with studies of light, vegetation, cloud formations, and the exact way mist moves through a mountain valley at dawn. Every leaf in that painting is botanically accurate. Every rock formation is geologically precise. It is less a painting and more a portal. The 19th century's version of virtual reality, designed to make the viewer feel they had actually traveled to a place most of them would never go. And the movement that created it? Completely erased from mainstream cultural memory. We are talking about the Hudson River School, a group of painters who, between the 1820s and 1870s, did something no American artist had ever seriously attempted before. They decided that the American wilderness itself was worth worshipping. Not Europe, not classical mythology, not portraits of kings and generals, just mountains, rivers, storm clouds breaking over the Catskills, and the particular quality of golden light that settles over the American landscape in the hour before sunset. And here is the part that will genuinely surprise you. The works these artists made are now selling at auction for figures that compete with the most celebrated paintings in the world. A single Thomas Cole canvas. Cole, the man who literally founded this movement, recently fetched over $450 million in combined catalog value across major institutions. These are not minor curiosities sitting in storage. These are cultural treasures of the highest order. And America collectively decided to forget them. So today, we are going to fix that. We are going to walk through who these painters actually were, what they were really trying to say, how they built an entire visual language for a nation that desperately needed one, and why right now, in 2025, their work feels more urgent and more relevant than it has in over 100 years. Stay with me. Because this story starts not in a gallery, not in a museum, not in a wealthy collector's drawing room, but on a riverbank in upstate New York, with a self-taught painter who had never formally studied art a day in his life, and who was about to change everything. Thomas Cole arrived in America from England in 1818 as a teenager, with almost nothing to his name. His family had emigrated in search of a better life, and Cole spent his early years doing whatever work he could find: engraving, wallpaper printing, portrait work in small Ohio towns. He had no formal fine arts training, no mentor, no patron, and no real reason to believe he would ever become anything other than a working craftsman. But Cole had one extraordinary gift. He could look at a landscape and see it not as background, not as scenery, but as meaning, as argument, as something that needed to be said. At the time, American art was largely considered a lesser cousin of European art, technically competent at best, but without the depth, the history, or the cultural weight of what was being produced in London and Paris. If you wanted to be taken seriously as a painter in the early 19th century, you studied abroad. You painted classical and biblical scenes. You painted the portraits of important men in important rooms. You did not paint a river bend in Connecticut and expect anyone to call it significant. Cole disagreed, and in 1825 he took a steamboat up the Hudson River into the Catskill Mountains with nothing but a sketchbook and a determination to capture what he saw. He came back with canvases that stunned New York's small but influential art community into silence. The painter John Trumbull, a man who had studied under Benjamin West in London, one of the most respected artists of the revolutionary generation, saw Cole's work hanging in a shop window and stopped in his tracks. He reportedly said they were the finest landscapes ever painted in America. Word spread fast. Within a year, Cole had patrons. Within 5 years, he had a movement. But here is what most people miss when they talk about the Hudson River School. These painters were not simply nature lovers with brushes. They were not producing pretty pictures for wealthy people's living rooms, though that happened too. What they were doing was something far more ambitious and far more political than it appears on the surface. They were making an argument about what America was. Think about the position America was in during the 1830s and 1840s. It was a young nation, barely 2 generations old, and it was deeply insecure about its place in the world. Europe had centuries of recorded history, ancient ruins, Gothic cathedrals, Renaissance masterpieces, royal collections that stretched back 1,000 years. When a European aristocrat looked around his ancestral home, he saw evidence of a civilization that had endured for generations. America had none of that. The oldest buildings in the country were barely 100 years old. There were no ruins, no monuments, no layered archaeological history of the kind that gave European culture its sense of weight and legitimacy. What America had was wilderness. Vast, terrifying, magnificent, largely unmapped wilderness. Cole and his followers, Frederick Church, Albert Bierstadt, Asher B. Durand, John Frederick Kensett, and a dozen others, looked at that wilderness and made a radical decision. They said, "This is our inheritance. This is our cathedral. This is our Colosseum, our Parthenon, our Sistine Chapel." God did not write his greatest work in stone in Rome. He wrote it in the Catskills, in the Rockies, in the vast untouched forests of the American interior. That reframing was not just aesthetic. It was theological, philosophical, and deeply patriotic all at once. Cole and his circle were heavily influenced by a strain of American thinking that saw the natural world as a direct expression of divine will, that to stand before a mountain at sunrise was to stand before evidence of God's presence in the world. The wilderness was not something to be conquered and cleared. It was something to be reverenced.